Hi everyone. I wanted to record a message today. As we all know, this is the 30th anniversary of the AIDS epidemic. And on behalf of my cause, Rise Up to HIV, I would like to read the following message. In 1981, I was nearly 5 years old. It was a happy time in my life. My favorite toys were my pound puppy, my glowworm, and my new bike. This was also the year I started kindergarten, and I still remember my kindergarten teacher, Miss Campbell, and learning my ABCs via the animal people. This was also the year I learned to swim, and my dad taught me how to ride a bike without training wheels. I would play my Atari and my ColecoVision all day. I loved those games, Frogger and Donkey Kong. I had one of the hottest Hot Wheels around, and a huge collection of Garbage Pail Kids and Matchbox cars. I would play and watch TV all day. I couldn't get enough Tom and Jerry, Sesame Street, and Mr. Rogers. When it was not my turn to watch TV, I would watch MASH with my father, or General Hospital with my mother. I remember the ever-famous Luke and Laura wedding on General Hospital. I looked forward to sleepovers at my cousin's on the weekends, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, Michael Jackson on MTV, Saturday morning bowling with my mom and dad, and nearly daily shopping trips to the mall with my mother. As a child growing up in the 80s, I was definitely the epitome of a Toys R Us kid. I was oblivious to what was happening in the big world around me. Aren't we all at that age? My parents did a good job at shielding me from all the sorrow and negativity that was going on in the world. All the while, my parents, hoping my future would only know joy and happiness. As I was turning 5 and continued growing up in the 80s, AIDS began to rear its ugly head and spread with vengeance. By the beginning of July 1982, a total of 452 cases from 23 states had been reported to the CDC. And then the disease began spreading worldwide. Much of the 80s was spent figuring out this disease and how best to treat it. People didn't want to talk about it. Our government ignored the disease. In the 90s came the dreaded AZT treatments. By January 1st, 1995, a cumulative total of 1 million cases of AIDS had been reported to the World Health Organization Global Program on AIDS. 18 million adults and 1.5 million children were estimated to have been infected with HIV since the beginning of the epidemic. Later in the month of January 1995, the CDC announced that in the US, AIDS had become the leading cause of death amongst all Americans aged 25 to 44. 30 years later, the disease is still rearing its ugly head, with approximately 56,000 Americans becoming newly infected each year. Through 2007, more than 576,000 people with AIDS in the US have died. Since the epidemic began. Globally, since the first cases of AIDS were reported in 1981, infection of HIV has grown to pandemic proportions, resulting in an estimated 65 million infections and 25 million deaths. During 2005 alone, an estimated 2.8 million persons died from AIDS. 4.1 million were newly infected with HIV, and 38.6 million people were living with HIV since the pandemic began. With the advent of new drugs, scientists have been able to suppress new infections to a point where the disease becomes undetectable. And scientists have been able to identify reservoirs in our bodies where latent HIV hides and where current medicine cannot get at. Researchers throughout the world, but particularly right here in the United States, are working tirelessly to finally eradicate this illness. Never have we been as close to a cure as we are now. In an email communication with Dr. David Margolis, within the next few years, studies will be rolling out in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. That will be the next step towards the cure. Until we get to that cure, those of us infected or affected by HIV/AIDS across the world must keep fighting, not just for our livelihood, but for upcoming generations. Keep advocating, keep educating yourself and the public. Volunteer, keep on top of your health, and donate if you can to AMFAR. That's AMFAR.org. They have been leading the fight against HIV since the beginning. Again, that's AMFAR.org. On this, the 30th anniversary of the epidemic, we are at a perilous time in the history of HIV/AIDS. Because of budget cuts across the country, people in many states are being placed on waiting lists to receive life-saving medications. People are even facing the possibility of their drug benefit being cut off completely. People are worried. My fear is we will begin to see a flashback to the 80s. People dying, but this time not because we have no drugs to treat the illness, but because we don't have the funding to do so. This is just not right. We must also begin to call out these drug companies that charge exorbitant amounts of money for HIV medications, simply because they hold the patent. These reasons which prevent people from obtaining life-saving and life-sustaining medications is simply unacceptable in the 21st century. In closing, I have just 2 wishes. My first wish is that my mother gets the lung transplant she so desperately needs. Mom, you have held in there for so long. I love you so much, and I am glad that you have made it to another year. My other wish is that we will get closer to finding a cure for HIV/AIDS, and that these acronyms will soon be written into history. Until we get to that cure, we must make sure that everyone living with HIV and AIDS has equal access to care. Today, to those survivors who have lived with the illness longer than I, and particularly to those who have lived with the virus for 20+ years, I stand in line behind you when the cure arrives. And I now stand with you. Let's keep the hope alive that one day we will live in a world free of HIV/AIDS. Sometimes I wish, just for a day, that I was 5 again. May you only know happiness, prosperity, and good health in the years ahead. Take care and be well, my friends.